The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable. This week on Q&A, Salem Radio Network host and author Hugh Hewitt discusses his latest book titled The Happiest Life, 7 Gifts, 7 Givers, and the Secret to Genuine Success.
Hugh Hewitt, in your latest book, The Happiest Life, you say it's the first time you really ever discussed your kids.
Yeah.
Why?
Early on, we had an unfortunate experience with a guy who heard me talking about my daughter, who at the time was very small, on television, and he threatened her. And so we stopped talking about kids on air until they're all out of the house and gone around the world. So I have had that debate with a lot of public figures, and as a result have often said to young people who are in our business to be very careful about how much you push your children forward, because there are crazy people in the world who will try and get at you through them.
How old are they now?
The youngest is 22. They're all gone. I'm not paying for college anymore. The others are 25 and 28.
Do they listen to you on the radio?
One does, the other two do not. My daughter doesn't care much for politics. My 2 sons do, but only one of them listens, and he loves talk radio. He loves the whole business.
We're going to talk about a lot that happened in your life, but my first question would be on your work itself. Why do you spend this much time on the radio with all the background, your Harvard background, your Michigan background?
I think radio is the longest and the best form of media that's left. What we're doing right now is an hour-long conversation. It's unprecedented. Only C-SPAN does long-form conversation anymore. You and Charlie Rose are the guys I know who read books the way that I read books in order to talk to the authors seriously. And it's tremendously revealing when an author's had their book read these days, because they don't get many people who have actually read their books and know what they're talking about with page notes. And it's so rewarding to them that I get a great deal of satisfaction of an author who says to me, in fact, the highest compliment is, "That's the best interview I've had on this book tour." Just got it from Charles Krauthammer, and loved the interview on Things That Matter, his new collection of essays, some of which are old but is autobiographical. You know, that makes my day. So I like radio. 3 hours is an abundance of time, and I can do so many different things.
Where specifically would we find you sitting every day?
In Irvine, California, I have a studio. Or KRLA in California, I have a studio. And when I'm in Washington, D.C., the Heritage Foundation lets me use a studio. But my own studio, my own personal studio, is a very modest, probably 1,100 square foot, 3 rooms with a producer in front of me, Dwayne, an engineer, Adam, on my left. So the traditional radio setup.
And what time of day do you do it?
3 to 6 in the afternoon, West Coast time.
Biggest affiliate you have nationwide?
It's got to be New York City, AM 970, or KRLA, AM 870 in Los Angeles. So New York and Los Angeles are the biggest radio markets in the world.
How long have you done this?
I began radio, that's a tricky question. I began radio in 1989 for KFI. I began my syndicated show on July 10th, 2000. So I've been doing my syndicated national show for, I guess, the 14th year now.
So you got a degree at Harvard and went to University of Michigan to get a law degree.
Yes.
And I understand you teach at Chapman, you're part of a law firm, you have this show. How can you do all this?
I treat my life like college. When you go to college, you have a schedule in your head. You know what you're doing on Monday, Tuesdays, Wednesdays. Well, I'm at the law school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm in the studio every afternoon. I'm at my law firm Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And then I travel quite a lot and I juggle. No one gets to do exactly what they want, but I get pretty close. I've been very blessed in that regard to always say to people, like the dean of the law school who hired me, or Jim Doty who built Chapman University, I'd love to teach here. Can we work it into the parameters of my life? And they said yes. And Ed Atzinger allowed me, he's the man who founded Salem Radio Network along with Stu Epperson, who allowed me to build the studio in such a way that I could both teach and practice law. So people have been very accommodating, and I've learned to always ask for what makes the most sense for me, and people will usually work their way around it.
What kind of law do you practice?
2 kinds. Environmental law, which is endangered species, wetlands, the development of land that is fragile or in any way restrained by government code. And then products liability law is what my partners do, and I assist as I can with the media side of that and some regulatory side.
Do you ever find yourself getting conflicted?
No, I've never had a conflict because I try and keep the world very, very separate. And if I'm talking about something in which my law firm might have an interest on air, I would disclose it immediately to the audience.
Chapman University is where and when did it start?
Chapman is 100 plus years old. I don't want to get the date wrong, but it's more than 100 years old. It was Chapman College for about 75 of those years. It is located in Orange, California. It is now ranked among the most rapidly growing, both in reputation and difficulty in entering, in the United States, because it's in Southern California, and Jim Doty, the president, has got it so abundantly endowed and supported by such a tremendous community of business people in Orange County that the Dodge Film School, the law school of which I am a part, the business school, the Argyris Business School, they're all taking off. And so Chapman is sort of where USC was 20 years ago, and I imagine will be another USC in another 20 years. Lacks a medical school, but I wouldn't put that past Doty.
What do you teach there?
Con law. I've been teaching con law since we opened the doors.
Why?
Well, I was on the D.C. circuit when I came out of Michigan Law School and had a unique experience there because my judge, Roger Robb, whom I don't know if you remember, he was on the D.C. circuit with George McKinnon, a Nixon appointee, became ill. And when he was ill, the other judges took his two clerks, a fellow named Terry Ross and myself, and they swapped us around for a few weeks in each chamber. So I got to work for Robert Bork, got to work for Justice Scalia, got to work for Justice Ginsburg. They were all appellate court judges at the time, and a judge named Spots Robinson. And they were all compelling individuals for 2 or 3 weeks, and they'd give me a case and we'd work on it until Judge Robb came back and Judge McKinnon took over most of our clerkship. And I just loved the business of being around the Constitution when you have people who know what they're doing with it. And so I like to teach it, and I love very much the fact that everything that happens in America can be taught in con law. There's not anything that doesn't come through the court, and there isn't anything that doesn't show up in an opinion that's interesting for my students.
What do you most remember from Justice Ginsburg?
That she was very careful, very precise. I am not great spelling. I am not so terrific on the punctuation side. Judge Ginsburg was very, very precise. Justice Scalia was very, very voluble and funny. And Judge Bork was as intimidating an individual as you might imagine for a 25-year-old guy.
When did you get to know Chief Justice John Roberts?
He served in the White House counsel's office at the same time I did. We shared a suite in the old executive office building on the first floor. At that time, the 17th Street side was used, and the counsel's office was the back right corner of that area. So we had a terrific White House counsel's office. I was succeeded by Chris Cox, went on to Congress, of course, the SEC. The Chief Justice was there from the beginning until I think he went to the Solicitor General's office in '86, about the time I left the White House counsel's office. Fred Fielding was the boss. He came back subsequent and served President Bush as his chief counsel as well, counsel of the president. And Dick Hauser, who's the one of the chief legal counsel for Boeing, was our deputy counsel to the president. So we had an extraordinary, Larry Garrett, who went on to be the Secretary of the Navy, was in that office. I was the bottle washer, the briefcase carrying youngest guy in the office who got to do all the stuff like protect the presidential seal, the tough stuff they gave to the Chief Justice.
What year?
1985, 86.
So the most candid you can be about John Roberts?
He cannot shoot a jump shot. We had a White House basketball team. I was the coach. I put it together. We were 0-10. I even brought in ringers. We couldn't win for the life of us. No one. Peter Robinson, the speechwriter, was next door to us as well, and he was on the team, as was Josh Gilder. We were horrific, terrible, so I can be candid about that. However, and I sent the Chief Justice upon his confirmation a copy of this. We were together on the White House VTOES, V-TOES, the Nike Challenge 5K team, which included Pat Buchanan, Dick Hauser, the Chief Justice, myself, and Elizabeth, I'm blanking on her last name. You had to have at least one woman, and we did pretty good. I don't know if they still run the Nike 5K up here, but we were a pretty good team.
So how surprised were you when John Roberts became the Chief Justice?
Brian, the most interesting thing about that is the finalists were Michael Luttig and John Roberts, who are very close friends. Michael is now the General Counsel of Boeing, was on the Fourth Circuit, and I had no idea whom the President would pick because they are so smart and they are the same person, and I think they would rule the same way. So I was pleased for the country that either of them would be the Chief Justice. I thought perhaps it would be Luttig because I thought that it would be perceived that Michael would be more conservative than the Chief Justice is. But when Roberts came out, and especially in the Sebelius decision, I think his genius showed. And Sebelius, a very controversial decision. People watching right now will think I'm out of my mind. They were very disappointed when the Obamacare decision came down. But now that it's a train wreck and the end game of liberalism, people will be able to study that for 100 years, and they'll say what he did was exactly right for the court, for the country, and ultimately for what I consider to be the off-course correction that we're on for writing that course. So it's a pretty brilliant piece of work.
How much involvement were you in the Romney campaign?
I had no involvement in the campaign. When the governor wrote his book, and he did write his campaign book, he asked if I would do a soft edit on it, and I was happy to, and I'm happy to run through it and pick up some peculiarities. He had some tics, etc., that most writers would see. Overuse of the colon, for example, semicolon. He was in love with semicolon. So I did a light edit on it, but that was the only thing I had to do with it because I had to cover the campaign, so I stayed officially away from it. I was polling for him and was deeply disappointed when he lost, though.
Did you speak for him?
No, I didn't speak for him. I did not campaign for him, except on the radio. Every day I would urge everyone listening to the radio, please go out and do it. In 2008, when he was seeking the nomination, I did campaign for him. In 2012, he got it so quickly that there was really no campaign to be done.
Don't talk show hosts really make a mockery out of the law that says you can only give so much money to a candidate?
Well, that law is no longer a law because of Citizens United. But yes, you could argue that talk show hosts make unlimited contributions by being on the side of someone. I have a list of candidates at my website, my Act Right list. I said, I want you to support Meade Treadwell in Alaska, Tom Cotton in Arkansas, Tom Tillis in North Carolina. I have a long, long list. And I think that is terrific. And I think that if the New York Times wants to do the same thing, they ought to be able to do it, because I'm a First Amendment. If I was Justice Black, I'd have a Constitution in my back pocket, and it would say, Congress shall make no law respecting. And I would point to the fact that, yes, I do make a contribution with words every day, but that's what the framers intended.
So, but we still have, you can only give so much money per candidate per race.
You can only give to a candidate, but I can give as much time as I want and money as I want to a cause or to a 527 or to after Citizens United, corporations have no restraint whatsoever. So as an individual, neither do I. And I think, in fact, right now we've got the guy running around from the West Coast who's very green. He intervened in the Virginia race. I can't think of his name, heavily for Governor McAuliffe, for Governor-elect McAuliffe. And he writes big billion-dollar checks to people, not $1 billion, but hundreds of millions of dollars to people. Mayor Bloomberg writes big checks. Luckily, talk shows exist where you don't have to have that kind of a wallet to make an impact. You can do a lot of campaigning and bring a lot of ideas to the public's attention without having to buy the airtime.
Go back to Salem Broadcasting. What is it?
Salem is a publicly traded company under the symbol SLMN on the New York Stock Exchange. It was founded by Ed Atzinger and Stu Epperson when they graduated from Bob Jones University sometime, I believe, in the 50s. Originally with the intention of only doing Christian programming. But over the years it grew organically because they are together something of a genius at spotting underused signals and developing them into full-blown signals. And now it has more than 100 stations. It has a communications division that is online and internet. It also has music programming. So it's a fully diversified communications company now. Its talk lineup is Bill Bennett, followed by Mike Gallagher, followed by Dennis Prager, followed by Michael Medved, followed by me. So we have 5 syndicated hosts. And on the Christian side, Janet Mefford. Together, I think we represent the best, strongest, and most able lineup of talk show hosts in the business, although we are friends with all and enemies of none, and I have many good friends in the business who don't work for Salem. Mark Levin is a very good friend of mine, dating back to Reagan Justice Department days, and so we compete against each other in the same time frame, but we are friends, and that's what's nice about our business.
Well, explain why in the last 5 years or so, 5.5 years, on some talk shows, and you can tell us what your own philosophy is, you'll tune in and Barack Obama at the very beginning of the show will be something negative will be said about him, and it'll go for 3 hours. Mm-hmm. Every day, no matter what decision he makes, under almost all circumstances, he has made a bad decision. He's a bad guy. He's a socialist, a communist, whatever. You go down the list. What's that all about?
Well, let's parse that. That's a great question. I don't think he's a evil man. I think he is completely incompetent and way above his head when it comes to the office. And I watched Reagan up close. I worked for Richard Nixon in exile, so I know what it's like to screw up the presidency. And I had enormous respect for W, and he made mistakes. It's an impossible to do job, unless you're Eisenhower. I guess he did it pretty well for anybody. But President Obama has pursued a politics which is as divisive as any as I've seen. I'm 57. Passing Obamacare without a Republican vote, not one, put us on the course that we find ourselves in today. I'll have on the show tomorrow, back in California, Yuval Levin, and Yuval's got a new book out on where left and right came from, Thomas Paine versus Edmund Burke. I'm looking forward to reading this on the airplane tomorrow because Yuval's a pretty smart guy. President Obama is a genuine man of the left. He's not Bill Clinton. He is not Michael Dukakis. He is not Jimmy Carter. He is a man of the left. He believes, he's a law professor. And I live with law professors, right? I'm on the Chapman Law faculty. And when we get into faculty debates about things, we go at it as academics do, not with a great deal of world experience. When I talk land use with property professors, they really don't have much of an idea what they're talking about the actual building of houses and the planning of parks and streets. And I think President Obama is really Professor Obama. And as a result, politics has become extremely polarized, not as bad as it's been in the country before. I mean, the 20s were terrible. The Civil War years, obviously. The Federalist Papers, those were rock-throwing, name-calling, terrible times. The segregation years, the desegregation effort. The country's been through worse than this. But in terms of pure ideological argument, this is as vigorous as it's ever been. Nobody ever cared this much.
Let me go back, though, to the question really wasn't what your opinion is of the president, but why is it that these talk show hosts, and maybe you're one of them, although I listen to you, I don't remember you doing this exactly this way, but they start at the beginning and it goes on for 3 hours. It's a constant negative.
Yes, I don't do that.
Constant.
Because I'm bored by that. That would bore me. I only...
Does it work?
It does work. And I was about to say there's a market for it. And why is MSNBC programmed the way MSNBC is programmed? I can't watch it. It's unwatchable for me. I can't watch Ed Schultz. I can't watch Rachel Maddow. It's unwatchable. But there's obviously a market for it. I do watch Chris Matthews. In fact, he's on in the studio when I'm on because I think he's ebullient and funny and worth watching. There's a market for everything in America. And Rush, who invented the format and is a radio genius, Rush and Oprah are the two most gifted communicators in America. They have built and sustained the largest audiences over the longest period of time of any two people in America. So what is it that they did? Oprah cast as her target audience middle-aged women between the ages of 30 and 65 and built a program for them. Rush built a program for center-right America, now increasingly right America, that had never been served by broadcast before. And it exploded. He went on the radio the same time I did in 1989, but I went on local in L.A., and he was on L.A., and he was predicted to fail. People don't remember this, but when the Fairness Doctrine ended in '88, there was nothing out there. Rush was first. And a lot of programmers across the country said that will work. Radio's got to be local. If it's not local, no one's going to listen to it. And he blew up. And he's still big. He's the anchor store of every radio mall in America. Every radio dial is a mall. Every radio station is a mall. And they have some specialty stores, and they have some big Nordstroms. And Rush is Nordstrom. And I am, I don't know, Sports Chalet or something. I'm pretty big, but I'm not Nordstrom. And I have my listeners, but I'm not Nordstrom. And I've got 100 stations, and Rush has got 600 stations. Well, who does he serve? He serves people that do not believe that in Washington, D.C., there's anybody who listens to them. And Rush listens to them. And he listens to them very carefully. And he's also very funny. Sean Hannity has done very, very well. And Sean and I are friends. He's been very good to me. He's a gentleman. He's actually, people will tell you he's the nicest man in radio. He is the nicest man in radio. He blew up because he is the nicest guy in radio, and he asks questions that ordinary people want asked of important people, and he muscles it up a little bit with them. Mark Levin is brilliant. Mark is irascible as can be and can be explosive, but how did he sell all those books? The Liberty Amendments. It's about the Constitution. Now, I write books about the Constitution. I'm lucky if they sell 5,000 copies because they're about the Constitution. He wrote 150,000, 200,000 copies of the Liberty Amendments. Who are those people that are buying those books? And they're folks who are not served other than on talk radio. So they do sometimes start mad and stay mad. But these are important times and big issues. And Obamacare is, and I use that because the president uses it. If he called it the Health Care Act, I'd call it the Affordable Health Care Act, but he called it Obamacare. I'm very careful about the presidency. I always call him President Obama. The office is important to me. Anyone who's worked in the White House knows that. I think he's a wonderful father. I think he's a terrific husband. He's just a terrible president. And so, a transformative president, he's either really right or he's really wrong. In fact, in Commentary Magazine coming out in December, I'm going to talk with, I'm blanking on his name right now. He was the Deputy Secretary of Health and Tevi Troy. Dr. Troy will be on with me today. Cover commentary article is on Obamacare, and he writes at the very beginning of it. It hasn't come out yet. I got the advance copy. Conservatives will not be able to see if it works. Liberals will not be able to see if it fails. They're so emotionally invested in one or the other. And he walks down and he lays out some parameters. Either way, it is either going to be the biggest success or the biggest failure in American domestic politics ever. That's why it's that tense. That's why that market's out there.
Going back to what I was getting at, though, on the talk show stuff, how many people in America do not ever listen? I mean, I run into people that say, I wouldn't listen to that stuff under any circumstance.
Lots. My guess is more than 75% never listen to talk radio. What's great about being a talk show host, I can walk around, as opposed to a television person, nobody knows who I am. I walk around the streets of
yeah, but you did television
DC.
for a long time.
I did LA, they know who I am because I did television every night in Los Angeles for 10, 12 years, actually. The nightly news for PBS. But radio talk show hosts are not recognized instantly. In fact, Rush is often able to move somewhat anonymously through the world, as opposed to Brett Baer, across the hall from you. If Brett goes out, people will know him, or Britt Hume, they'll know him, or anyone on television. They won't have any privacy. Radio people have privacy. And even my voice, 1 out of 10 people will recognize my voice in public because they just don't hear it. They'll hear Rush, and Rush is ubiquitous and everywhere. Sean Hannity is one of the most recognizable people in the world. A lot of people don't listen to it, and they should give it a try. And I'll tell you why. Dennis Prager, who I know you know and you've interviewed, is among the most thoughtful men in America. He thinks all the time. It's like Krauthammer. They sit around and they think, and they puzzle, and they try to get to the right answer. And Dennis wrote a beautiful book, Still the Best Hope, about America going forward, in which he talks about sort of secular absolutism and its war on faith and its war on traditionalism. It's a deep book, and it's a beautiful book. He does 3 hours of radio a day, and he talks to interesting people. And so if they turn on my show, they would hear Peter Baker, we were talking a little bit earlier, from the New York Times, talking about his book, Days of Rage, or Nicholas Kristof, or they would hear Jonathan Alter, who's a friend of mine, talking about his book. They'd hear a lot of liberal voices, a lot of smart lefties. Yesterday, Mark Leibovich was on my program when I broadcast from Heritage. He's been your guest, New York Times Magazine national correspondent. Great, terrific radio guest. Krauthammer. They'll hear voices they otherwise wouldn't hear at length. Doing what you do, we have commercial interruptions. I have 38 broadcast minutes in an hour. You have 60 broadcast minutes in an hour. But talk radio really is the last place in America where you will hear an extended conversation, other than C-SPAN, that will go longer than 10 minutes.
If you had to listen to a liberal talk show host in America, who would you pick?
I would make, do I get to invent that they get to have a show? Because right now there aren't any who have it. NPR's got all the liberal talk show hosts. But if I could, I'd get Peter from the New Republic. What's his last name?
Beinart?
Yeah, Peter Beinart, who used to be on my show a lot. Now he's harder and harder to get a hold of and to book. Peter would make a terrific talk show host. He's a very engaging, he's delightful. Jonathan Alter would make a terrific talk show host. He's also engaging and delightful, but they don't have the time. They don't live their life in one place long enough. And you really are anchored to a studio. When I go on the road, I have to go somewhere where there's a studio, because in our business, you really can't be off the air for longer than a week or two unless it's December or the 4th of July. December, we can all go away.
In your book, you alluded to a moment in history, 1995, when Newt Gingrich became Speaker, and you'd been involved in public television, and that you got a call suggesting that, and what I'm getting at is, you earlier mentioned that NPR has all the liberal talk show hosts, but you got a call from You can explain
PBS
it.
Central.
Yeah.
Bill Coben was the president of KCET, which is used to be. It no longer is affiliated with PBS, but at the time KCET was the flagship of PBS on the West Coast. And we had a nightly news and public affairs show. Pat Morrison, Kerman Maddox, myself, and Ruben Martinez. The four of us sitting around doing what they do now on C-SPAN, not on C-SPAN, but on CNN and on all the other network shows, yammering about the news. And I was the only conservative in the entire system. And when Newt Gingrich won and the landslide occurred, Bill Coben got a call from PBS Central. You have a conservative, don't you? Yes, his name is Hewitt. We need him to do a national show. What on? Whatever he wants. We have to balance out, because they had Bill Maher on all the time, and they had on liberals all the time. And if you watch the NewsHour, it was unbalanced and remains to a certain extent unbalanced. David Brooks is their conservative. David is a conservative, but he's not a conservative's conservative. David is a sort of like me, a center-right guy. So they just gave me a show, and I went off and did a show on religion, and that was wonderful, and it changed my life, called Searching for God in America in 1996, and got me interested in writing about and doing a lot of broadcasting about religion. But PBS was very unbalanced, and NPR is the most unbalanced. In fact, it would be the one thing I would have gone to bat for to cut out of the budget as a symbolic thing, because it does not represent well the broad spectrum of American opinion that funds it. I think it's unfair. I think this show is very fair, and C-SPAN has always been very fair, especially in the morning edition, but not NPR. NPR is ideologically driven, which is why left-wing talk radio can't work, because all their listeners are listening to Morning Edition. They're listening to NPR.
It's popular, though.
Oh, it's very popular. It's great product. It's superb quality.
And they say that whenever they're challenged on it, that very, very little of the money that comes from the feds what is it, 1.5% or something like that, they say.
Yeah, that's true. And that's why they shouldn't be unwilling to part with it. If in fact they would. I used to do Pledge for PBS. I would sit up there in front of KCET camera and beg people for money with Ed Asner. Ed gave me a wedgie once on television when we were doing Pledge, because he's a wonderfully funny, he is a way left-wing guy, but he's a wonderfully funny and engaging man. So I don't mind begging for money for public television. I just don't think the taxpayer should be obliged to pay for that, which they never hear themselves mirrored. Ever do they hear themselves.
I want you to watch some videotape of somebody that you know had on your program, I think you said 70 times.
Yeah.
Let's watch Christopher Hitchens for a moment and get your reaction to what he says.
Yeah.
That people are, I think, becoming fed up with being pushed around by ordinary mammals who think that they are better than us because they have God on their side. Enough with this. It's very insulting, it's very threatening, it's very stupid, and it's becoming, and now we have the chance that apocalyptic weaponry will fall into the hands of messianic states or organizations, Armageddon-type forces. Clear and present danger.
Did you ever believe in God?
No.
Did your parents?
Yes. They must have done at some point. Well, I think my father probably must have done. I don't know this, because of course I always have this doubt about people who even affirm that they believe in God. Do they believe in it all the time? Do they believe in it every day? Do they never have crises of faith? Why do they have to keep on going to church to prove that they believe?
As you know, God is mentioned in your book probably more than anything else.
Yeah.
And what would you say to him if he was sitting there?
I talked to Christopher Hitchens 70 times on the air and many times off. I was a guest in his home. I introduced him at lectures. I moderated. I love the guy. I miss him a great deal. His brother, Peter Hitchens, is a devout man of faith, and he and his brother would debate about this. What would I say to him is what I always said to him, which is, one of us is right, and we will both find out, because I think I'm right. And I think he never had the conversion experience, at least when I didn't talk to him for the last 2 months of his life after he lost his voice. I did do a 3-hour interview with him about his book, his autobiographical memoir, which was such a terrific book, as he was weakening. And I wouldn't push him on God, because it wasn't appropriate for me to preach or to proselytize to a man who knew he was in the last days of his life. But either you have religious faith or you don't. And a lot of that is, I'm not a Calvinist. I don't believe in that, but I believe you've got to be open to it and ask the right questions and pursue honestly how this world is. Krauthammer has in his new book, I asked Charles about this on the air this past week, what's your belief of God? And he has the Einstein view, which is God does not play dice with the universe. That it's so complex, it's so organized, it's so wonderful. Well, if he does not play dice, then he intends to be understood. So you've got to go about trying to understand him in the right way. And there are sacred texts. Some of them are right, some of them are wrong. I love talking to people about it. The Dalai Lama has a different approach than does Chuck Colson, both of whom I interviewed for the Religion series. And everybody has a different approach. Someone is correct. And right now, Catholics, of which I am one, are deeply conflicted over Pope Francis, even though he's saying exactly what Benedict and John Paul II had to say about things, but he's saying it in such a different way that it's unnerved a lot of people. I think anyone who studies that man, Francis, will see the genuine person of Christ revealed quite elegantly, just as they did in the suffering of John Paul II. The intellect of God is in Benedict. And so I like to say to people, John Paul II rebuilt the house, Benedict decorated it, and Francis is opening it up and asking everyone to come in. Francis is really quite a remarkable individual.
How do you become an evangelical Roman Catholic Presbyterian?
That's what I call myself. You're born a cradle Catholic, and you're devout, and you're raised that way, and you have a real encounter with God young, and you go to Catholic school through 12 grades, and you go to Harvard, and you're very, very, very Catholic, and you're Catholic in the White House, and the bishops start sending in letters. And I did a very human thing. I got very angry with the bishops when they would send us letters on nuclear weapons and economics that made no sense at all. And they were signed by a fellow named Bishop Walsh, who confirmed me. Slapped my face. Catholics will understand that part of the practice. Bishop Walsh was a wonderful man who couldn't play bingo without being told how to spell G-O at the end. And he was just a great priest, but he was not intellectual, writing us dumb letters about war and peace and dumb letters about economics. And the Bishops' Council became very left-wing. Brian Hare and the rest of them hijacked it, so that the church went way left, and I left. And put myself under the care of a very, very smart evangelical pastor by the name of Mark Roberts, who's now at the Laity Lodge, a theologian in residence in Texas, but at the time was pastor in California, and began to read deeply in evangelical theory and loved the preaching and loved the theology. But eventually, Archbishop Chaput of Philadelphia, then of Denver, got a hold of me and sort of taught common sense and told, yeah, you're a Roman Catholic. Here, read this. And he wrote a very good book. Did you happen to talk to him about his book? He should be a cardinal along with Dolan when the rules are right. You have to have a certain period of time where your successor has to age out of the job. So he'll be Cardinal Chaput after a while. Tremendous intellect, but a great heart. And so then I went back to confession, went back to Mass, and now I go to Mass on Saturday night, and I go to the Presbyterian Church on Sunday, and I tell people I'm covered. I've got it both ways.
Did you have a particular moment when you became an evangelical?
Yeah, I did. In 1991, I was on a men's retreat, and I thought to myself, this is not only correct, this is deeply true in a way I had not previously. Someone called it a born-again experience. I wouldn't, because I'd already committed my life to Christ when I was very young. But just a moment of intense awareness of God.
Do you ever have a moment in your work, especially on the air or when you're speaking, where people don't want you to mix the two?
Yes. Happened yesterday in a law firm when I was talking to a lawyer with whom I was doing some work, and I asked him what he believed, and he said, no one's ever asked me that before. I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm a journalist. I ask people that all the time. If I was interviewing you, Brian, I'd go into your faith life. It's the most important thing you can find out about someone, other than, are they happily married? Are their children well? How have they suffered? What do you believe about God? These are the most important questions in anyone's life. And as an interviewer, the best interviews I've ever done, Hitchens, for example, is when we talked about, his mother committed suicide, and he was called to her to recognize the body and pick up the body. And that's a terrible thing to have to do. And we talked about that, and that has something to do with his lack of I think, belief of God, that anything that awful, how could anything that awful allow you to believe in a benevolent, good force at the center of the universe? Roberta Hestinus, who was one of my guests for Searching for God in America, was the president of World Vision at the time. She said, it's awfully hard to believe in God when you're in an AIDS camp in Africa and you're surrounded by thousands of children who are dying of AIDS. She said, it's awfully hard The problem of pain and suffering is very difficult to get through for some people if you have a very limited conception of time. You just got to get infinite in order to understand it. The Mormons do this so much better than the evangelicals and the Catholics. I spent a lot of time studying Mormon theology for PBS and then to write my book about Romney. And they all, their view of time, they teach infinity from almost the beginning, which I think makes them much more devout in their practice. And the best Catholics are those. There's an old Catholic teaching that you should begin every day by thinking about 4 things. Death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And if you begin every day by thinking about death, judgment, heaven, and hell, my friend Professor David Allen White, who lives across the river here, taught me that, you'll have a very good perspective on the day's events.
You say that you really like Christopher Hitchens, but you say you don't particularly care for Sam Harris?
No, I don't.
Let's watch Sam Harris and get you to react to this.
This would all be accomplished if we treated everyone who spoke about God on the floor of the Senate as though they had just spoke about Poseidon. I mean, just imagine, you know, we have all these hurricanes in the Gulf, and some senator gets it into his head that we should really be praying to Poseidon. I mean, this, after all, is his jurisdiction. The ocean is reclaiming our cities. Clearly, that would be the end of that person's political career. And yet it's not like someone discovered in the 3rd century that the biblical God exists, but Poseidon doesn't. I mean, these claims have exactly the same status.
That's shtick. Now, the difference between Sam and Christopher Hitchens is one of intellect. Hitch is formidable, deep learning, across a wide array of abilities and fields, and he was fearless. And he would go to Beirut and get into fistfights with the Syrian Nazis and almost get kidnapped and pulled away. He had earned the right to be cavalier about everything and to be as abrupt and abrasive as he wanted to, because he was Orwell. Christopher Hitchens was a true man of freedom. Sam Harris is a promoter of Sam Harris. And so to be provocative that way with that which is most important to people, without the book learning and without the thinking and without the world experience, I think is cavalier and trite.
What if people said that about Hugh Hewitt?
They can, and they have, and they will. And so they have to read, for example, The Happiest Life. I try and put on display, here's how I've lived my life, here's what I've done, and here's how I've earned it. And I had this conversation yesterday with 3 young reporters from the Washington Free Beacon. And the town is now lousy with 20-year-olds with opinions. And, you know, when I didn't have an opinion. I wasn't published until I was 28, and I wasn't really published until I was 35. And by that time, I'd had a few jobs in government and been confirmed by the Senate and had gone to law school and clerked for some smart people. Then I began to have opinions. Now the town is full of 25-year-olds who know what's wrong with it. And I'm amazed, and I'm amused. And I think that people really should be over 30 before they start to opine on that which could impact people's lives in a serious. They should have children. They should be married. If they don't have children, they should be uncles and aunts and be responsible and have life insurance policies.
But you could be a congressman when you're 25.
I know, and not many of them. That was because of the time of the Constitution. Your lifespan was so much less expectant.
Joe Biden was elected when he was 29 to Senate.
I rest my case. I actually I bring up Joe Biden a lot for the adage that some people just do not change, period, in Washington. He was the same way he was when he was first elected. Remember in Time magazine when he was first elected at 29, and they said, man on the come, man on the rise, or something like that. And I said, man, he's going to be around for a long time. It's like Jerry Brown in 1978. Jerry Brown is married now to Ann Gus, with whom I went to law school and shared a seat in torts. She's the smartest person in California. I hope she's running the state. Jerry Brown has been around since 1978. Joe Biden's been around since 1978. They have a right to their opinions. They've lived a lot of life. Nixon was on 5 tickets when he spoke. Reagan had been governor and had been actor, had fought the communists in the Screen Guild. These are not 25-year-olds when they came to their worldviews. President Obama, by contrast, going back to what we're talking about, and Sam Harris, they showed up with their views. They hadn't really lived through crises. They hadn't been in this city for long enough to be prepared to do what they're asked to do. Sam Harris has no experience. President Obama at least had 2 years in the Senate.
But President Obama got accomplished what the Clintons could not get accomplished by getting the health care bill passed.
Yeah, actually, George W. Bush passed the health care bill. when he lost the 2008 election so badly, when the financial crisis happened on his watch. People forget that Senator McCain was ahead when the financial crisis occurred. And that was a panic. It really wasn't the result of W's policies. It was a panic. Panics recur in our history. We'll have another one at some point. And the bubble, you could blame it on Greenspan more than Bush. But that swept in a supermajority that's very rare in American politics, and the framers did not intend that to happen. And that supermajority produced a super bad bill. And it's going to take a supermajority in the opposite direction, or the court, to strike it down. It is fundamentally unworkable, Brian. And I think I said earlier, I think the Sebelius decision was appropriately decided because people had to see how bad this law is. There's a limit to what government can do. It cannot do what it's trying to do here. It's impossible to do it.
This book, you refer to The Happiest Life, 7 Gifts, 7 Givers, The Secret to Genuine Success.
Yeah.
When did you get the idea to do this, and what's the message?
The message is that generosity underscores almost every happy person I know. I know a lot of very good, very successful people. I've known 3 people I consider to be authentically genius: Richard Nixon, John Roberts, and Mitt Romney. I thought they were all at a level so far above other people that I knew.
How do you measure that?
Intuitive grasp of facts and the ability to retain so much information that they know everything before you tell them. I asked Tag Romney, what's the most frustrating thing about your dad, when I was writing a book about his dad? He said, he already knows everything I want to tell him, and because he's constantly reading. And so genius is the ability to absorb information, organize it, and act on it in a successful, systematic way. It's not physics, it's not natural science genius, it's a whole different thing, it's political genius. But those 3 were political geniuses. And they were also...
How much time did you spend around Richard Nixon?
A lot for 2 years, in 1978 to 1980, and then quite a lot from 88, 89, and 90 when the library was being built.
What did you do with the library?
I was the executive director overseeing its construction in Yorba Linda, California, when he was back in New Jersey, organizing its contents. I was overseeing its construction, flying back and forth. And in San Clemente, I was one of his writing staff.
What did that cost?
Nixon Library was $22 million, privately raised.
Where did the money come from?
There was not one gift larger than $2 million. I believe Bob Aplenop gave $2 million, but I'd have to check my facts. It was a lot of...
He's the aerosol man?
Yeah. Yeah, very well. Very good memory. And Bill Simon, the former Secretary of the Treasury, was the chairman of the foundation that raised it. Most of it was raised before I got there.
Why did you do that?
Because the president had been very good to me. President Nixon had been very good to me. He was the best boss I ever had. He would spend an endless amount of time answering questions. I wasn't a very good writer when I started. I was a very good writer when I finished. Ray Price was the chief of the writing staff. There were 3 of us, Todd Lindbergh, myself, Ray, and the president, who wrote everything out in longhand. Great editor. He taught me how to read. He taught me what to read. He invested a lot of time in young people who are still around. Marin Stremecki, John Taylor, who's now an Episcopal priest in California. Of course, Monica Crowley on Fox was Richard Nixon. He would hire young people and invest a lot of time in them. So he was a terrific boss. And it's after the fall. So it's, we're in isolation in San Clemente, and he was just beginning to emerge. I came on staff after Frank Gannon, Diane Sawyer, and Ken Kachigian, the memoir staff, and the Frost Nixon interview staff left. Ray Price, Todd, and I came on staff to help him with The Real War and Leaders. He was just an amazing guy. What a life.
What role did Diane Sawyer play back in those days?
I was not there at the same time she was, but she was the principal research editorial assistant. Frank Gannon was the principal drafter of chapters that Nixon was uninterested in the memoirs. So if you had to go and write a chapter on Venezuela, Frank is an incredibly prolific writer and talent. So he and Nixon were the lead authors on our end, and it's a great book. And then Diane Sawyer and Ken Kachigian were sort of the backups to those 2.
Was there a moment around Richard Nixon that you had that you've never talked about?
I've told the story a couple of times, but I've never told it on air. My mom and dad came to California when they were both alive. It was 1978. And I called over and said, can I bring my parents by to meet you? Because this is a big deal for a Midwestern couple. My dad was a small-town lawyer and stayed in the same firm for 50 years, and both were born in Ashtabula, and they'd seen him in a parade, but they were going to come meet a president. And it was awkward. as we sat down in the not the Oval Office, but the Nixon office overlooking the Pacific, until my mom, God bless her, finally said, well, what do you think's going to happen with China? And we left 2 hours later, Brian. He talked for 2 hours about the world to my mom and dad, because they were my mom and dad. He was very generous that way. He was a very giving fellow. And I saw him do that again and again with ordinary Americans who would ask him important questions. He was terrible at small talk. But if you said to him, what's going to happen to Brazil? You'd be in the office forever, because he had time in those years. This was before he was actually back in New York or back down in D.C. occasionally when he would take visitors. Woody Hayes showed up. Bill Walton showed up. People would just show up in San Clemente to talk to him, and he would spend hours with them. It was a fascinating period of time. Robert Sam Anson wrote a book about that got pretty close. Nixon people won't write books about it. That's kind of our omerta. We'll tell a few stories here and there, but that's up to Julie and Tricia if they want to write that book. But he had a fascinating post-presidency in the way that W is having a fascinating post-presidency. Bill Clinton has done it differently from any other president of my era. Eisenhower lived quietly and would talk to the presidents. Nixon was in disgrace, and then he slowly emerged and played a world role. Bill Clinton has never stopped being president. I mean, he's always out there. He's fascinating. It's a different study. And he may be back in the White House again. W has been, his father wrote a piece for Fortune magazine, How to Be an Ex-President. And W has followed those rules exactly, which is disappear, raise a lot of money for a lot of people, and be good to the folks who are good to you. He's terrific with the troops.
Go back to the radio show that you did.
Yep.
What got you interested in radio, and how did you get a national 3-hour-a-day talk show?
I am the luckiest guy in broadcast, because I was giving press conferences at the Nixon Library, and the program director of KFI in Los Angeles had a reporter named Jay who called him up and said, this kid, I was 32 at the time, is pretty doggone good on his feet. So I got a call out of the blue from a radio program director. It never happens in a major market, offering me a weekend talk show. I said, well, that sounds like it beats working. And so I went over there and went to work for KFI on the weekends on Saturday, along with people who became, Laura Schlesinger had a national show, Bill Prest had a national show, myself, Bill Handel is the biggest morning drive guy in America in Los Angeles. All weekend shows, that's what talk radio used to do, is bring up the bench on the weekend. And George Oliva hired me, was the guy at KFI. And I did that until the local PBS station heard me on the radio and said, hey, do you want to do television? I said, sure, that beats working. And I went over and started to do television. And then a wonderful man named Drew offered me a guest slot on KABC in the morning one time when their morning hosts were on vacation, John and Ken. And that's when Ed Atzinger heard me, and he had a fellow named Russ Houth who'd been following me around for years, my work, and they recruited me to Salem and offered me a show. And so it was all, I've never looked for a job. Jobs have always found me.
So is Dwayne your producer?
Yeah.
If I was Dwayne and I first came to work for you, what would you tell me as your producer that your own rules are about how to have a good show?
We must find the most interesting people who will be as honest and authentic as possible, who won't give us talking points. And so our regular guests, the people that we have on again and again and again, have got to be very smart, very funny and witty. We've done one segment, Brian, we're in 14 years now. We've done it every week for 14 years, and it is The Smart Guys with Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean of the University of California, Irvine Law School, and John Eastman, Dean Emeritus at the Fowler School of Law at Chapman. John is a man of the right, Erwin's a man of the left. They go at it on constitutional law. They're funny. They like each other. Mark Stein is the favorite guest of my audience. Mark Stein may be the funniest man in America. He is hilarious, and he's brilliant, and he knows everything about everything. Before him, Michael Kelly was everyone's favorite guest, the late Michael Kelly. I talked to him not long before he went to Iraq and died on the march up to Baghdad when his vehicle flipped over. He was funny and ebullient, and he brought his game. Christopher Hitchens was 70 times he came on. He never failed to entertain because he was authentic and funny. I'm not smart enough or good enough or funny enough to be 3 hours of interest, but there are a lot of smart, funny people. If I get Christoph to come on more, people would really like him because he's very thoughtful and thought-provoking.
Nick Kristof from the New York Times.
Yes, and he'll only come on once in a while. E.J. Dionne comes on once in a while. he's very thought-provoking, but they don't like it. They don't like the format too much because I will become very aggressive, not angry, but I'll push. Mark Leibovich is, we're talking about, a great guest. Michael Shearer, New York Times. So Dwayne, by the way, would do more to tell me how to make a good show, because Dwayne was in radio production before I became a radio host.
But what kind of rules do you have that you, for instance, you say, "No, I'm not doing that"?
I will not do profane people. There's no vulgarity on my show. I do not. Profanity is prohibited by the FCC, but I don't like vulgarity, and so I stay away from that. I stay away from the salacious. There's blue radio out there. It's a term of art for people who want to do titillating subjects, and it's not me. It's vulgar. But other than that, I don't have any rule. I'll cover any story that's interesting to my audience, because the audience should win. Because if they don't, they will go across the dial and they will go to somebody else. So every day you've got to bring an A game and be prepared to do. I do 5 segments an hour, 3 hours a day, 75 a week, 300 a month. I've been doing that for 14 years. And there are enough interesting people to do that. Just as you probably, how many interviews have you done?
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea.
I tried to count it. I think I've done more than 25,000, but I put 10,000 in the book because I know I've done 10,000 interviews.
But going back to your whole schedule, how do you maintain, how do you keep your mind open, and how do you have time to research? You're traveling, you're speaking. You have a road show that you do, I guess. You and Dennis Prager go out.
Yeah, we do. We love going out. It's called Ask a Jew. It's very funny.
How do you keep track of all this?
I was blessed with the capacity to remember things. And so when I read something, it's not a photographic memory, but when I read a book, I can remember it, and I take copious notes. And I'm a very fast reader. I'm going to read Yuval Levin's book on the plane tomorrow on the way back. So I will have 4.5 hours to, it's about a 300-page book. I can do a 300-page book in 4.5 hours.
You call your wife the fetching Mrs. Hewitt.
Yes.
Now, how do you keep her happy in all this if you're running around all the time?
Fetching Mrs. Hewitt goes with me when she can, now that our children are grown. She travels with me. We're heading out of town tomorrow, or 2 days from tomorrow. She didn't come on a one-day trip. She won't do the one-day trip. But she has been very generous with her time. But remember, I'm mostly in Southern California. Even though the broadcast is everywhere and I will travel 1 or 2 day trips to markets. Radio hosts have to go to their markets. I go to Denver a lot because my KNUS market is terrific. It's probably my largest share of any radio market that I'm in America. Phoenix is a close second. And so I try and go to those places often, or I go to Ohio, where Cleveland, Columbus are big markets for me, or Louisville, Kentucky, or New York City. Places that matter a great deal I try and get to. But they're 1 day or 2 day trips, and she'll come with me. So she is a Christmas tree in my life. She is a present every day.
Been married how long?
32 years.
Where'd you meet her?
I met her at Pete Wilson fundraiser on San Diego Bay, and I always thank Governor Wilson for that. And he says that more than 40 couples met at Pete Wilson events. He's been in the business so long.
What was she doing there?
She was also attending as a college Republican. I was 22 and she was 22. And she was living in Fallbrook. She's the daughter of a Marine Corps colonel and had been invited by a friend to go to this thing, and so we just met there.
So you go back to Chapman University. If you listen to talk radio, you hear, especially the conservatives, you hear constant advertising for Hillsdale College.
Yeah.
Is Chapman the Hillsdale of the West Coast?
No, because Hillsdale is a great book school, and Chapman is not. Chapman is
conservative.
Chapman's not conservative. No, Chapman is very diverse. I would say our law faculty is at least 50% very liberal. And there's John Eastman and I at the Fowler School of Law who are conservative, and that's about it. We've got maybe 2 others who are semi-conservative, but it's a classic liberal faculty. There are some conservatives at Chapman. The business school is quite conservative, but it's a normal liberal arts college. Hillsdale's a great book school, and Larry Arnn is like Doty, a great college president, and like our mutual friend Mark Guerin, a great college president. But different colleges need different kinds of leaders. Hillsdale is a lighthouse institute. I call it the Lantern of the North. It is conservatism's great beacon of enduring ideas, and it turns out generation after generation of leaders of the future. It's extraordinary. The Kirby Center, which is not far from here, is now where Hillsdale is running its kids through Washington, D.C. I say kids, they're young men and women. They produce many, many military officers. They produce many, many scholars, many, many high school teachers. There are some others like Thomas Aquinas College in California, a great book school. Biola University is becoming a lighthouse institution. down at Houston Baptist. John Mark Reynolds is turning it into a Lighthouse Institution. Colorado Christian University, for which I'm going to teach this summer, is becoming a Lighthouse Institution.
That's where Bill Armstrong, the former senator of Colorado.
He's a terrific man. It's a terrific university. So I think in reaction largely to the proliferation of mediocrity at many universities, Chapman not among them. Chapman has maintained its standards. But at the proliferation of mediocrity at many places, these elite conservative institutions are springing up to say to mothers and fathers and to children who are so interested, come here. It will be rigorous. It will be hard. Larry Arnn always tells people on my radio show, he's on once a week for an hour, this will be very hard if you come to Hillsdale. You will work. He did a 6.5-hour class on Aristotle's Ethics last week. We were laughing about it. It's the hardest book in the world. I can't make heads or tails out of it. But he's turning out just incredible people.
Speaking of books, this book is how many for you?
That's 14.
In but not of, a guide to Christian ambition. Somebody told me this week that's their favorite book that you wrote.
It is clearly the most significant book that I wrote. More people come up to me about In But Not Of and say, I read your book when I was in high school or college, and as a result, I took your advice. And it's full of, I got asked by a lot of people, I'm sure you do as well, how do I get to do what you want to do? When I was young, people used to say, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, I want to be George Will. And I got lucky enough to be sort of George Will, meaning I get to be a pundit. But a lot of people would say, I want to be in broadcasting, I want to be a commentator. And so I wrote down what you have to do, in my view, to do that. A lot of it is practical. A lot of it is about books that you need to read and people that and how to ask questions and be curious and engaging. Because everyone's got a story, you know this. Everybody's got a fascinating story to tell if you can just kind of get it out of them.
When do you write these books?
On airplanes, in the middle of the night. I don't sleep much. I've always been super energetic. One of the gifts I talk about in the 7 gifts is energy. Either you can fake it, but some people have super abundant energy, and I happen to be one who are on the higher end of that scale. Encouragement,
energy, enthusiasm, empathy, good humor, graciousness, gratitude. Which one's the most important?
Gratitude.
Why?
Because the people, I wouldn't be sitting here if not for Richard Nixon and Ed Atzinger. You know, everyone's got mom and dad, or at least most lucky people have mom and dad. Some people only have one, and some people don't have either, and it's important to recognize. But we all, any of us who achieve any amount of happiness, owe that to a long line of people. There's a chapter on teachers in the book. I often have to go toe-to-toe against the teachers' unions who want to do bad things. I'm very ambivalent about Common Core, for example. But I had terrific high school teachers. Ron Karenbauer, Kathy Santucci, Fred Hoover. I name them all because I had these terrific high school teachers in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, Warren, Ohio. And in every town in America, there are a cadre of teachers. Can you name your best high school teachers?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And so I'm grateful to them, but I would not be here but for those people. So I think it's very important to be very open about gratitude.
There's some advice you have. You have a lot of advice in this, but one of them that I underlined was Thanksgiving dinner. How to quickly break up Thanksgiving dinner with a shouting level argument. How do you do that?
Well, you can always bring up Sarah Palin. She divides a room more quickly than anybody else in America. But there are a few ways to do it. I do an annual show on how to get Thanksgiving over. But in that same chapter, I encourage everyone to grade their relations with their in-laws, A, B, C, D. And if you're under a 2.0, try and bring up the average by cutting someone from the team. It's not worth ruining every holiday.
In our remaining 30 seconds, if somebody doesn't have Hugh Hewitt in their town, can they listen on the internet?
Absolutely. Listen every day at HughHewitt.com or iHeartRadio or on any of 100 different affiliates that carry it over the air.
And do you have podcasts or anything?
Oh, yes, it's all podcasts. The Huniverse is a subscription service, but iHeartRadio is free, so people can get it.
The Huniverse?
The Huniverse.
What is in the Huniverse? Every
minute of every hour of every radio show I've ever done.
From the beginning?
From the beginning. Yeah, from the syndicated beginning, from 2000 forward.
The latest book of Hugh Hewitt is called The Happiest Life. 7 Gifts, 7 Givers, The Secret to Genuine Success. And we thank you, Hugh Hewitt, for joining us.
Brian, thank you for having me. An honor.
For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
Coming up next on C-SPAN,